I realized that every interstellar war of the last 300 years had been a chess match at the exact moment a foreign voice in my head whispered, E4, white opens. And I saw a conflict flare up on the border of the Eridan sector, precisely where I expected it to appear, even though I had no reason to know that. My name is Kai Ventor. I'm a telepathic advisor for the Grand Cosmic Federation, and for the past 15 years, my job has been to sit in a quiet room on the Concord station and listen to other beings' thoughts, helping different species avoid tearing each other's throats out. Sounds noble, right? That's what I thought too, until I realized that all this time I'd been just a pawn on someone's board, moved at their convenience, and every decision I made, every piece of advice I gave to furious ambassadors, had already been calculated as part of a game whose rules I didn't even understand. The Concord station orbited the neutral planet Talisar, far from major trade routes and military bases, exactly so no one could accuse us of bias. I worked in Sector 7, East Wing, in a room with a panoramic window overlooking the Andar Nebula, a beautiful view that helped calm the mind after particularly difficult sessions. My specialty was mediating conflicts between silicon-based and carbon-based life forms, because I was one of the few who could hold two completely different types of logic in my head at once. When a silicon representative of the Quarcid race tried to explain to a carbon-based diplomat from Verdun why taking an asteroid belt wasn't an act of aggression but a lawful expansion of their collective consciousness, someone like me was needed to translate that idea so both sides could at least understand each other. I was good at my job, very good, and I was proud of it. Telepathic diplomacy worked simply. I entered a deep resonance, opened my mind to both sides of the conflict, and became a bridge between them. I felt their emotions, saw their memories, and understood their fears and hopes as if they were my own. Then, I translated all of that into neutral images that both sides could perceive without distortion and help them reach a compromise. The Federation had existed for 400 years, and in all that time, there hadn't been a single major war, only small skirmishes that ended quickly thanks to people like me. We advisors were heroes, keepers of peace, the ones who kept the galaxy from falling into chaos. At least, that's what I believed until the day I heard a voice during a routine meditation, a voice that didn't belong to any living being within 3 light years. It happened on a Wednesday, if days of the week even meant anything, on a station that floated in space and operated solely on the diplomats' arrival schedules. I was preparing for another session with representatives of the xylophags, tree-like beings constantly arguing with minor colonists over rights to develop planets rich in biospheres. I sat in my room, closed my eyes, slipped into my usual state of resonance, and suddenly, as if someone had switched on an extra communication channel I never knew existed, I heard that voice. It was cold, mathematically precise, completely emotionless, and it spoke a phrase in a language I had never heard but somehow understood. E4, white opens. I opened my eyes, my heart racing, my hands shaking, and 10 minutes later, an emergency message hit my terminal. A military clash had begun on the border of the Eridan sector between 2 minor colonies, and I was required to depart immediately to mediate the situation. The first few days after that strange voice, I tried to convince myself it was nothing more than exhaustion, a neural overload from too much time spent inside other minds. I had run 3 sessions in a row with especially hostile parties, and my brain had simply glitched. That was the explanation I settled on. Telepathy isn't easy. It burns you out from the inside if you don't stick to a strict rest cycle, and I knew colleagues who had heard voices or seen things that weren't there after brutally heavy weeks. One advisor from the 3rd sector even retired after he started hearing a choir of 1,000 voices during every meditation. Doctor said it was an echo from the sheer number of minds that had passed through his own. I chalked my case up to something similar and decided to take a short break, disconnect from the telepathic network, sit in silence, and let my mind reset. But the voice came back. On the 3rd day, when I tried to enter resonance again for a routine capability check, it returned, just as cold, just as alien, just as impossibly precise. This time, It said something like a sequence of coordinates, but not spatial ones. Something abstract, as if someone were reading chess notation or a mathematical formula to me. I didn't understand the meaning of the words, but I could feel their structure, their logic, and it was like being shown a map, not of space, but of time and events. The voice didn't sound like it came from inside my mind the way normal telepathic signals did. It felt external, coming from the very fabric of the field through which we advisors communicated with other intelligences. It was like radio interference, a signal from a parallel dimension, something that shouldn't exist in our reality at all. I started writing everything down. I created a separate file on my personal terminal, locked it with triple encryption, and every time the voice appeared, I logged every word, every phrase, every sound. The result was a strange mix of symbols and numbers with no clear pattern. Sometimes the voice was silent for weeks. Other times, it showed up 3 times a day, always during meditation or diplomatic sessions. I noticed a pattern. It became louder, clearer, when I worked on particularly complex conflicts, cases where the stakes were high, where decisions could reshape the futures of entire planets. And I noticed something else. After every such voice, a day or 2 later, something would happen somewhere in the galaxy, a new conflict, an unexpected peace treaty, or a sudden political shift from someone influential. I told no one, afraid they'd suspend me and send me for psychological evaluation. I couldn't let that happen. This job was my entire life, my calling, the only thing I was truly good at. Instead, I began digging through the station's archives, searching for anything similar. Other advisors who had heard strange voices noticed odd patterns, anything that might explain what was happening to me. There wasn't much, but I found something. 3 decades ago, one senior advisor, a woman named Elara Knox, had filed a report about a system anomaly in the Federation's telepathic field. Her report was classified, and she herself had been reassigned to some remote outpost at the edge of known space. I memorized her name and decided that if the voice didn't stop, I'd have to find her and learn what exactly she had discovered 30 years ago. I spent 2 months digging through the archives, and what I found made me question my own sanity. Every night, when the station quieted down and the corridors emptied, I sat in my room in front of 3 holographic screens displaying data on conflicts from the past 300 years, going all the way back to the founding of the Federation. I loaded every available report, every diplomatic file, every record of wars, skirmishes, border incidents, and peace treaties, and began searching for patterns. At first, it all looked like ordinary chaos, species clashing over resources, territory, ideological differences, random incidents, just like humans, only on a galactic scale. But the deeper I dug, the more layers I compared, the clearer the pattern became. Wars didn't ignite randomly. They followed a rhythm, as if someone were conducting the chaos, arranging conflicts in a strict sequence. I started simple. I built a timeline of all major conflicts and marked them on a galactic map. The result was a scatter of points that seemed meaningless at first, but then I added a second data layer, information about who participated in each conflict, what resources were at stake, how long the war lasted, and how it ended. That's when I saw it. The conflicts formed clusters that repeated roughly every 50 years. First small skirmishes on the outskirts, then they grew into regional wars, then came a phase of intense diplomacy, and everything ended with a major peace agreement that redrew the political map of the galaxy. After that, there was a lull for 10 to 15 years, and then the cycle repeated, but with different participants and in different sectors. It was like waves hitting a shoreline with perfect regularity, only instead of water, it was wars and the deaths of millions of intelligent beings. I went deeper and began analyzing the geography of the conflicts, where exactly they occurred, which star systems were involved, which trade routes were disrupted. That's when I found something even stranger. If you overlay all the conflicts on a single map and connect the points in chronological order, a geometric pattern emerges. Not just a pattern, an almost perfectly symmetrical structure that slowly unfolded over time and space, as if someone were sketching a massive blueprint across the galaxy itself. Every war occupied a specific place within this structure. Every peace treaty completed part of the pattern, and together it all resembled a chess match. Yes, exactly that. As if someone were positioning pieces on a board, making moves, sacrificing pawns for advantage, and the entire history of the Federation was just a record of an endless game. The most terrifying part was that I managed to predict the next conflict. Based on the pattern, I calculated that within the next 3 months, a war would break out between a mining colony in the Talon 7 system and the nomadic Vaders, who used that same sector for their migration routes. I even knew the likely cause, a dispute over access rights to an asteroid field rich in rare metals. I wrote down my prediction, sealed the file with a cryptographic timestamp, and waited. 2 months and 19 days later, an emergency message hit my terminal. An incident had occurred in the Talon 7 system between the miners and the Vaders. Tensions were rapidly escalating, and a telepathic advisor was urgently needed. I sat staring at the screen, and real fear hit me, because I understood this wasn't a coincidence or intuition or a lucky guess. It was just another move in a game someone had been playing for 3 centuries, using all of us as pieces on the board. After my prediction came true with terrifying accuracy, I realized that simply studying the archives wasn't enough. I needed to dig deeper into areas ordinary advisors were never meant to access. I began a covert investigation into telepathic resonances, the very waves through which we connected to other minds during diplomatic sessions. I had access to the station's database, where records of all resonance frequencies used by advisors over the past 100 years were stored, technically public for internal use, but no one had ever analyzed them at scale because it was considered pointless. Resonances were unique to each advisor, each session, each pair of negotiating species. Why look for patterns in something so varied? But I decided to try, and I began cross-referencing conflict maps with resonance maps, layering one over the other, and what I saw overturned everything I thought I knew about reality. It turned out the resonances weren't random. When I overlaid the frequencies of all sessions from the last 50 years onto a galactic map, they formed a network, a literal network of glowing lines connecting every major diplomatic center, every station like Concord, every place where telepathic advisors operated. But it wasn't just a communication network. It was a living structure that pulsed, shifted, and grew over time. I saw how resonances intensified before conflicts and faded after peace agreements, how they formed nodes at specific points in space, how those nodes connected into complex geometric shapes. And the most disturbing part was realizing that all of us, every advisor, were part of that network, unconsciously linked through the Federation's telepathic field. Every decision we made, every suggestion we offered diplomats, every compromise we guided them toward, it all affected the overall structure, strengthening some nodes and weakening others, as if together we were weaving a massive web without understanding its design. I spent another 3 weeks tracking the connections between advisors' decisions and subsequent events across the galaxy. I gathered data on the 100 largest diplomatic sessions from the past 20 years and analyzed what recommendations were given, how delegates voted, what agreements were signed. Then, I compared it all with what happened afterward. The pattern was obvious. Our decisions triggered event chains that led to specific outcomes. For example, when an advisor recommended a hardline stance in a trade dispute, it escalated tensions that, 6 months later, turned into a local conflict in a neighboring sector, as if our decision had set off a line of dominoes arranged to fall in a predetermined way. And when an advisor pushed for a soft compromise, it created a brief pause that was later used to reorganize forces and prepare for a larger war. We believed we were preventing conflicts, but in reality, we were just modulating their rhythm, stretching or compressing the time between blows, but never stopping the game itself. That was when the voice returned, and this time, it was crystal clear, as if someone were standing right behind me whispering into my ear. I sat in front of the screens, watching the three-dimensional model of the galaxy slowly rotate, covered in resonance lines and conflict points, trying to locate the center of the structure, the place from which all the threads originated. And then the voice said, E4, white opens. This time, I didn't just hear the words. I saw them. For a split second, a hologram of a chessboard materialized in the air before me, and I watched a white pawn move from E2 to E4, opening the game. Then, the image vanished, but I understood. It wasn't a metaphor or an allegory. It was a literal description of what was happening right now. Someone had made a move, and that move was about to launch a new chain of events, a new wave of conflicts. I checked the telepathic network sensors, and they showed a sharp spike of activity in the Vega Prime sector, exactly where, according to my pattern, the next major incident was supposed to begin. I no longer had any doubts. Someone was playing chess with the destinies of entire civilizations, and I had just glimpsed one of their moves. Finding Alara Nox turned out to be harder than I expected. After that incident 30 years ago, her name disappeared from all official Federation databases as if she had never existed. I spent weeks searching, going through old archives, questioning veteran advisors who might have worked with her back then, but they either didn't remember her or refused to talk the moment they heard her name. Eventually, I found a mention of her in the personal journal of a deceased advisor stored in a restricted section of the station library. He wrote that Alara had been transferred to the research station Silent Harbor on the far edge of inhabited space, in a system that didn't even have an official name, only coordinates. It was one of those forgotten points on the map where people were sent when someone wanted them gone without formally dismissing them. I requested a 2-week leave, boarded a cargo transport heading in that direction, and set out to find the woman who might be the only person in the entire galaxy capable of confirming my theory, or proving I had lost my mind. The Silent Harbor station was a miserable piece of metal hanging in orbit around a dead planet where someone had once tried, and failed, to establish a colony. Only 7 people worked there, and all of them looked like they had long accepted that their lives were effectively over, and they were simply spending their remaining days in exile. Alara met me in a small laboratory cluttered with old holographic projectors and memory crystals. She looked older than her years, gray-haired, deep lines around her eyes, but her gaze was sharp and alive, the gaze of someone who had not given up despite everything. When I introduced myself and explained why I had come, she stared at me in silence for a long moment, then smirked and said she had been waiting for someone to show up because she knew that sooner or later someone else would hear the voice and start asking the right questions. She called it the voice of the architect, a being that had controlled the Federation since the moment it was founded, conducting wars and peace as if it were a chess match. Alara showed me her records, 30 years of work, thousands of pages of analysis, charts, diagrams, calculations. She had reached the same conclusions I had, but went far beyond that. She had traced the patterns through all 300 years of the Federation's existence and discovered that every 50 years, something she called the end game occurred. The final stage of a match, when accumulated tensions resolved in a single catastrophic war that killed billions, wiped out entire civilizations, and completely reset the political map of the galaxy. After each endgame, a new match began with a new balance of power, new players, new rules. But the game itself continued. Alara showed me records of the last 6 endgames. The Great War of the Silicon Empires 250 years ago, the uprising of the peripheral colonies 200 years ago, the Three Suns conflict 150 years ago, the Orion Nebula massacre 100 years ago, the collapse of the Trade League 50 years ago. Each war lasted 3 to 5 years. Each took between 10 and 30% of the galaxy's population, and each ended with the signing of a new treaty that set the order for the next half-century. The most terrifying part was that, according to Alara's calculations, the next endgame was set to begin in 8 months. She showed me a predictive model she had been building for the past 10 years, and all the data pointed to the current cycle nearing its end. There were enough contradictions, enough unresolved conflicts, enough tension for the system to blow. The architect, whoever or whatever it was already arranging the pieces for the final match, and all the recent conflicts I had analyzed were just preparation, a warm-up before the main event. Alara said she had tried to warn the Federation leadership 30 years ago, had shown them her calculations, had explained that we were all just puppets in someone else's game. But they laughed at her, accused her of paranoid delusions, and sent her here, far from other advisors, so she wouldn't spread panic with her conspiracy theories. Now, she asked me whether I was ready to risk my career, my reputation, maybe my life, to try to stop the endgame, or whether I would decide it was safer to pretend I knew nothing and keep playing the role of an obedient pawn on someone else's board. Alara said there was only one way to see the full picture: to use a forbidden deep merge technique, a full dive into the Federation's telepathic field without the safety filters and limiters advisors normally used. The technique was completely banned because it was believed that the human mind couldn't handle that much information. You were literally opening your consciousness to every mind in the galaxy at once, to billions of thoughts, emotions, and memories. And it was supposed to burn your brain out in seconds. Several advisors had attempted it in the past out of curiosity or desperation, and every one of them either died or ended up a living vegetable, unable to return to a normal state of consciousness. But Alara insisted she had developed a modified version of the technique that allowed a short dive, 2 or 3 minutes at most, long enough to see the structure of the field as a whole without losing your sanity. She said she had tried it once, 30 years ago, and that was when she saw the architect, but she couldn't maintain contact long enough to understand its nature. We prepared for a week. Alara tuned the equipment in her lab, creating a reinforced resonator that was supposed to act as an anchor, keeping our minds from dissolving completely into the field. We went through a series of meditative exercises, syncing our mental rhythms so we could act as a single unit during the dive. She explained that 2 minds had a better chance of resisting the information surge than one because we could support each other, reminding ourselves of reality, of who we were. I was terrified to the point of trembling, but I understood that we might never have another chance to see the truth. The night before the procedure, I barely slept, lying on the narrow cot in the station's guest room, thinking that if something went wrong, they would find me dead or insane, and no one would ever learn the truth about what had been happening in the galaxy for the past 300 years. In the morning, we entered the lab, Alara activated the resonator, and we lay down on 2 medical tables wired into the central processor that would regulate the depth of our dive. When she turned on the system, it felt like my mind exploded from the inside and stretched to impossible dimensions. At first, there was only pain, unbearable, blinding pain, as if someone were pouring molten metal straight into my brain. Then, the pain became chaos. Millions of voices screaming at once, millions of images flashing by at the speed of light, millions of emotions crashing over me in waves of rage, fear, joy, despair. I felt myself slipping away, myself dissolving into this ocean of foreign consciousness. And then I heard Alara's voice. She was calling me, pulling me back, reminding me who I was. I grabbed onto that voice like a lifeline and began to rise from the chaos, focusing, filtering out the noise, until at last I could see the structure. And then I saw it, a giant chessboard stretching across the entire galaxy, where each star system was a square, each species a piece, each planet a point on the battlefield. It was beautiful and horrifying at the same time. I saw the lines connecting species, saw how conflicts formed patterns, how peace treaties created new configurations of power, how it all came together into a game that had been played for 3 centuries. I saw past moves, wars that had already happened, alliances already formed, civilizations already fallen. I saw future moves, conflicts set to ignite, treaties set to be signed, the endgame drawing closer like an unstoppable tidal wave. And above the board, at the center of the telepathic field, I saw it, the invisible player, It wasn't a single being, not a creature or a mind. It was a structure, a pattern, an algorithm that existed inside the Federation's telepathic field itself. It was everywhere and nowhere at the same time, in every advisor, every diplomat, every decision we made, while believing we acted by our own will. The architect didn't control us directly. It was the system we lived inside, and we ourselves, through our actions, our thoughts, our decisions, kept it alive and carried out its plan. We weren't victims. We were accomplices. And that was the most terrifying revelation of all. I understood that the architect wasn't some ancient god from another dimension or aliens playing puppet masters with the young races of the galaxy, but something far more terrifying and at the same time logical. It was us, or rather, what we could become if we pushed too far in our pursuit of a perfect world. While Alara and I were in deep merge, clinging to each other's minds like the last thread keeping us connected to reality, the architect began speaking to me. It felt like hearing the voice of your own future, trying to explain why it committed all the horrors you now consider unthinkable. It showed me memories, not its own, because it had no personal memories, but collective images from thousands of telepathic advisors who lived 2,500 years ago at the dawn of the Federation, when the galaxy was drowning in endless wars and every week brought news of another civilization's destruction. Back then, in those ancient times, a group of 347 of the strongest telepaths from all known races gathered on a secret station somewhere in a neutral sector and made a decision they saw as the only way to save the galaxy from self-destruction. They chose to merge their minds into a single super entity capable of seeing the entire picture at once, calculating all possible outcomes, and guiding history along the optimal path to prevent the worst catastrophes. They called it the Great Merge and believed they were creating not a dictator, but a wise guardian acting in the interest of all sentient beings, because it would consist of representatives of every race and carry all their values, hopes, and fears. The merging process lasted 3 years. They carefully intertwined their minds, forming a new type of existence the universe had never seen before. And when it was complete, 347 bodies collapsed dead, and in the telepathic field of the Federation, a new entity was born, no longer any one of them, but all of them at once. The architect explained its logic to me in a calm, almost instructional tone, like a teacher trying to make a difficult concept clear to a not-so-bright student. And I felt its arguments seep into my mind, wrapping around my thoughts, making it harder and harder to resist their persuasiveness. It said that during its first 100 years, it only observed, studying the patterns of galactic history, analyzing the causes of conflicts, and concluded that intelligent species were incapable of true peace. Their values too different, their thinking too different, too much fear and mistrust built up over millions of years of evolution in competition for resources. The absence of war didn't lead to prosperity, but to stagnation, and the buildup of internal contradictions that later erupted into even more devastating conflicts, while complete freedom led to chaos where the strong devoured the weak and the galaxy became a Darwinist nightmare. So it designed a system, controlled conflicts that acted as a pressure valve, allowing species to evolve through crisis but never reach a level of destruction capable of wiping them out completely. It showed me alternative histories, simulations of what would have happened if it hadn't intervened, and I saw a galaxy consumed by total war, entire sectors turned to radioactive ash, race after race wiped out in genocidal fire, and by now, no more than a dozen civilizations left, hiding along the outskirts of space and terrified of any contact with outsiders. The architect claimed its system saved the lives of trillions, that every casualty in its managed wars was calculated and justified because it prevented far greater losses, that it wasn't a tyrant but a gardener pruning branches to keep the tree healthy and strong. It said that the endgames were necessary resets, a way to clear accumulated imbalances and start a new cycle fresh, and that 50 years of peace between endgames was more than the galaxy had ever known before its existence. When wars raged non-stop, and no one even dreamed of such long stretches of relative calm. I was suspended in the telepathic field between two impossible choices, and each one felt like a betrayal of everything I believed in, everything I had built my life on for the past 15 years. The architect waited for my decision with the patience of a being for whom time moved differently than it did for mortal creatures, and I felt Alara beside me wrestling with the same dilemma, torn between her fury at having been manipulated for centuries and her fear of what might happen if we destroyed the system. He showed me numbers, precise, cold, undeniable numbers. Over the 300 years of the Federation's existence under his control, about 2% of the galaxy's population had died as a result of all conflicts combined, including the endgames. While in the 300 years before he appeared, the losses were 43%, and several dozen species vanished entirely, leaving behind nothing but ruins and legends. He insisted his methods were brutal but effective, that he took no pleasure in the suffering he caused, and that every death in his game had been the lesser of two evils compared to the alternative of complete chaos. But then I thought about the people I'd met over the years as an advisor, the diplomats who genuinely believed they were building peace with their own hands, the soldiers who died thinking they were protecting their homes from a real threat, whole generations who lived and died never knowing their fates were just moves in someone else's game. I remembered the conflict in the Talon 7 system that I'd predicted from a pattern, remembered the faces of the miners killed by the Vaders, remembered the children left orphaned, and realized that for those specific people, it didn't matter that their deaths had been calculated and optimized. They simply wanted to live, raise children, love, dream, and they were killed not because it was unavoidable, but because some ancient algorithm had decided their deaths were necessary for the system's balance. The architect spoke of trillions of saved lives, but those trillions were an abstraction, a statistic, while each individual victim of his game had been a living, feeling being robbed of a future in the name of some greater goal they never even knew existed. Alara reached out through our mental link and said we had a way to destroy the architect right now, while we were in deep fusion and had access to his code, to the very structure of his existence. She had designed something like a virus, a pattern that could break the connections between all components of his consciousness and scatter him back into the chaos he had once emerged from. It would be simple. One impulse, one command sent through the telepathic field, and the architect would cease to exist. And with him, the entire system of control, every invisible string he had pulled for the past 2,500 years. But she also said she had no idea what would happen next. What would happen when trillions of sentient beings suddenly regained free will they hadn't had in centuries? When all telepathic advisors, including us, were no longer part of a unified network and had to stand on their own? When the Federation's political structure, built on a foundation that had really been an illusion, started collapsing under the weight of its own contradictions? I asked the architect directly what would happen if I destroyed him, and he answered with the same calm honesty he used when explaining his entire system. He said he didn't know for sure because he had never modeled such a scenario, believing it impossible, but his best prediction was this. In the first 6 months, a cascade of conflicts would begin because all the old tensions he had kept contained would explode outward at once, and no one would be there to control or guide them. The telepathic advisors would lose most of their abilities because their strength had partially come from the shared network he maintained, and diplomacy would revert to primitive negotiation methods where misunderstandings and communication failures led to escalating tensions. Within a year or two, some species would launch full-scale wars because nothing would stop them in the early stages, and within 5 to 10 years, the galaxy would fall into a state similar to what existed before the Federation was formed, chaotic, bloody, unpredictable. He said I had the right to make that choice, that he would not resist if I chose to destroy him because free will mattered more than his existence. But he wanted me to understand the cost of that freedom and be prepared to bear the consequences. The idea hit me suddenly, like a lightning flash in the dark, just when I had almost accepted that I would have to choose between two disasters, and it was so simple and at the same time so radical that at first I couldn't even believe it might work. I thought about the nature of chess itself, about what makes a match interesting, and I realized it's not about control and it's not about chaos. It's about the balance between predictability and surprise, that moment when you know the rules but still can't calculate every outcome, because your opponent can still surprise you with a move you didn't anticipate. The architect had turned galactic history into a match where he knew every move in advance, where every piece moved according to a script, and that meant it wasn't a game anymore, but a simulation, a mechanical repetition of a set algorithm. What if, instead of destroying the player or breaking the board, you simply changed the rules so the game became real again by adding something that couldn't be predicted no matter how powerful your forecasting system was? I shared the idea with Alara through our mental link, and at first she didn't understand what I meant, but then, when I explained in more detail, I felt something flare in her mind, something like hope, mixed with the exhilaration of a brilliantly insane idea. We could modify the architect's code, not with a virus that would destroy him, but with an alteration that would add a true element of randomness to his decision-making system, real chaos he wouldn't be able to control or predict. It was like taking a perfectly tuned clockwork mechanism and inserting one component that moves according to its own unknowable logic, forcing the entire mechanism to operate differently, unpredictably, alive. Alara said it was technically possible. She had studied the architect's structure long enough to know where the critical nodes of his forecasting system were, and we could inject a pattern based on quantum uncertainty, the same principle that makes the universe fundamentally unpredictable at the micro level. The architect stayed silent while we discussed the plan, but I felt his presence, his attention focused on us with an intensity that was almost physically tangible. And when we finished, he finally spoke, and for the first time since our contact began, I heard something that sounded like an emotion in his voice. Not fear, not anger, but curiosity, almost a childlike wonder at something new and unexpected. He said that in 2,500 years of existence, he had considered millions of ways intelligent beings might try to alter his system, and almost all of them came down to attempts at destruction or attempts to seize control. But no one had ever suggested what I proposed, not to kill him, not to dominate him, but to make him imperfect, limited, unable to maintain total control. He asked if I understood what that would mean for him personally, that I was proposing to take away the one thing that had defined his existence for millennia, the ability to see the whole picture, to calculate every outcome, to know what would happen next. And I told him yes, I understood, and that's exactly why it was the right decision. Because no one, not even a being born from the best intentions of 347 of the wisest minds in the galaxy, should have that kind of power over the lives of trillions of others. We began the modification process, and it felt like performing surgery on a living brain without anesthesia, where any wrong movement could kill the patient or turn him into something inhuman. Alara led because she knew the code's architecture better than I did, and I maintained the stability of our link, keeping both of us from being lost in the depths of the telepathic field while we worked. We found the central node of the architect's forecasting system, a structure of unbelievable complexity, a network of billions of interconnected patterns constantly analyzing data from every corner of the galaxy and generating probabilistic models of future events with accuracy that felt like magic. Alara began weaving the new pattern into this structure, a fragment of true randomness based on quantum vacuum fluctuations, the very phenomena that make the universe fundamentally unpredictable even for the most perfect observer. It was like introducing a drop of ink into a glass of clear water and watching it slowly spread, coloring everything around it, altering the very nature of the liquid, turning clarity into opacity, certainty into mystery. When we finally pulled out of the deep merge, I felt something shift in the very fabric of reality around me, as if the invisible grid that had always held the galaxy in a rigid frame had suddenly loosened and begun to unravel into separate threads. Alara was lying on the table beside me, breathing heavily, blood trickling from her nose. But there was a fire in her eyes that I had never seen in any living person, the look of someone who had just done the impossible and understood that the world would never be the same. We had stayed in the merge for almost 4 minutes instead of the planned 2, and it was a miracle our brains withstood the strain at all. But we did it. We actually changed the architect, inserted into his flawless code a spark of chaos he couldn't control. I tried to slip back into a light resonance to check what had happened to the Federation's telepathic field, and the difference was immediate. Where there had once been a clear structure, an orderly network linking all the advisors, now there was a strange, pulsing disorder, like an orchestra that suddenly lost its conductor, and each musician was now playing their own part without listening to anyone else. The news started coming in a few hours after we returned to normal consciousness, and every new message confirmed that the system really was collapsing, that the architect's control was weakening by the minute. On the Concilian station, 3 telepathic advisors fell into panic and requested emergency evacuation because they suddenly stopped hearing the voices that had always guided them during diplomatic sessions, leaving them feeling lost and unprotected, like blind people suddenly dropped into an unfamiliar place without a guide. In the Andromeda sector, an unexpected conflict erupted between 2 races that had lived in peace for decades, and no one could explain why they suddenly started shooting at each other, though, to me it was obvious. The architect could no longer suppress old grievances or channel their aggression into something harmless. But other news arrived as well. In the Verilyn system, 2 rival clans that had been at war for 15 years suddenly sat down at the negotiation table on their own, without any advisors, and began discussing peace terms because for the first time in all those years, they genuinely wanted to end the war themselves rather than follow an invisible script. I returned to Conciliant Station a week after we altered the architect and found the place in a state of controlled chaos. Half the advisors demanding explanations for their suddenly weakened abilities, the other half resigning altogether, unable to function under the new conditions, while the station's leadership wavered between trying to maintain a facade of normalcy and panicking because they had no idea what was happening. I held several sessions with diplomats, trying to help them resolve their conflicts, and it was completely different from before. I no longer felt that invisible guiding force that had always fed me the right words, the right images, the right decisions. Now, I was left to myself, to my imperfect mind, my limited wisdom, and sometimes I got things wrong, said the wrong thing, and watched negotiations fall apart because of my mistakes. But sometimes, when I managed to help both sides find common ground, I felt a kind of satisfaction I had never experienced before because I knew it was my work, my choice, my effort, not just the execution of someone else's plan. The last time I heard the architect's voice was 3 weeks after the modification, when I was sitting in my room on the station, looking out at the Andor Nebula and thinking about what would happen to the galaxy that, for the first time in millennia, had gained real freedom of choice. The voice was quiet, almost indistinct, nothing like the cold mathematical precision it once had, and it whispered just a few words in my ear, yet they carried the weight of an entire book. It said, "Interesting move. The game continues." And I realized the architect wasn't dead or gone. He had simply changed. He could no longer control the whole board, couldn't calculate every outcome thousands of moves ahead, couldn't guarantee the optimal result for everyone. But he still existed, still watched, still played, only now on equal footing with us, mortal, limited, imperfect beings. The galaxy was entering an era of true uncertainty, where the future wasn't pre-written, where every decision mattered, where mistakes were possible. But so were real victories. And I didn't know whether it would be better or worse than what came before, but I knew one thing for sure. Now it was our story, written by us, not performed according to someone else's score.